Okay, thank you. All right, antebellum, before the war. It's Latin, and it literally means from 1820. Usually that's the agreed upon starting point till 1860. So that's what we're going to focus on, antebellum slavery. But just to give you an idea of how slavery is changing, between 1776, again, the birth of the United States, until the American Civil War, it is an institution that becomes more and more confined to the South. And it expands rapidly two ways: in numbers, the number of slaves in the United States, and it expands geographically. In 1776, you can find slaves in all parts of the United States. Just a small percentage, 2 or 3 of the percent of the population in New England, 15%, maybe 20% in the old middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and much higher ratios in the South. The difference after 1776 is that New England states end slavery during the course of the years of and right after the American Revolution. The middle states put slavery on the path to gradual emancipation, meaning a slave born a certain year upon reaching his or her 18th or 21st birthday would then be free. So it doesn't quickly, just by law, outlaw slavery. It's a slow process. The idea of the gradual emancipation was also attempted to be applied to the Missouri controversy in 1819 and 1820. In fact, it's a New York representative in Congress who says, why don't we do that? No more slaves can go into Missouri, the territory, and slaves who are under that age, once they reach the age of 25, they'll be free. So why don't we follow, he said, the path of my own state in New York. There are slaves in New York until the 1840s, probably even beyond, because they had been born before that law went into effect, and they were effectively grandfathered in to they'll be slaves until the end of their life. But more and more slavery is combined to the South, again, and concentrated in that area. In 1790, we have the first census of the United States. Again, these numbers are just to tell a story, not anything you have to commit to memory, because I don't ask you questions like that. But there are 700,000 slaves counted in the first census of the United States, the first time we have a census. In 1860, that number is 4 million. So it grows by numbers and it grows geographically. The other difference when we talk about how slavery changed is how we write about the institution of slavery. For a lot of our history, it had been written from the owner's point of view. Slave owners talked about their slaves, which is okay, but it doesn't really give, of course, the perspective of those who are enslaved. So it's mostly from the owner's view. Some historians in the past, if you're looking at the 1920s, 100 years ago, if you were a college student and you were learning about slavery, most of the, we might say, conventional wisdom is that slavery is a pretty benign institution. It didn't have an effect one way or another. Others said it was a total domination of other human beings. One historian said it's a school constantly training and controlling pupils who were in a backward state of civilization. That's the kind of writing that was done 100 years ago. Fortunately, it has changed because we changed the perspective. In the 1950s, we begin to talk about the institution of slavery from the slave's point of view. We also have a book that argued that slaves were basically equivalent of being infantilized or being in a childlike state. Books that were written after World War II. One book was called Slavery. That was just the name of it. It came out in the late 1950s. And so what this book argued was that slavery as an institution was so overwhelming that slaves were enacted like children, or never developed into the adulthood state because of the oppressive nature of slavery. Wasn't exactly true. But this was one of the arguments made. Now, when books are controversial and they come out, books that refute the first book are written. So we might say this guy's theory, which was called the Sambo thesis, a reference to the infant-like state of development of slaves because of what slavery did to the human psyche. That theory was basically blown up in the 1960s and 70s. But that book is out there. It's controversial. But if it hadn't been written, we might not have challenged the conclusions this author comes to. And so it changed. Well, of course, what kind of events changed in the history of our country? The civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. More minorities went to graduate school and got their masters and PhDs. We also began to take in the actual accounts of slaves. One of the things that happened in the 1930s during the New Deal, again, when 25–30% of the country was unemployed, the government paid writers to go find survivors of slavery who were still alive in the 1930s. They would have been obviously very young. Slavery ended in 1865, and take their accounts. A WPA narratives, Works Progress Administration. These were recorded, they were transcribed, you can buy them in collections of books now. And so someone had the bright idea that while there were some people who lived through slavery alive, let's get their story. And it was taken down. And finally, the perspective changed. Not slavery judged from the slave owner, but from the actual slave. We also know that two trends emerged in slavery during the time from 1820 to 1860. Masters began to, and owners, express more and more concern for what they called their people. And you would see this in diaries, in letters, in journals. My family, my servants, sometimes they even said slaves, part of their extended family. But they also renewed efforts in the antebellum period to promote slaves' dependence and docility, meaning that escape was suicide. Trying to start a slave rebellion, not going to work. So slave owners doubled down controlling the institution of slavery, and they actually had new restrictions on how slaves could move, the ability of owners to free slaves. It's called manumission. The idea of I either have a thought in my mind that owning another person maybe isn't a good thing, or I don't want to continue the institution of slavery. I can manumit the people that I own. Some states made it more difficult for slave owners to do that. They also tried to very much control the movement of free people of color in the different states, free blacks, men and women who were not slaves. I mean, as much as slave owners would like to say, your skin color dictated your condition. We talked about that in the discussion of Virginia. White free, black unfree. There are gray areas, of course. And so they wouldn't want slaves to intermingle with whites who would encourage them maybe to rise up and lead a slave rebellion, which really didn't happen. We talked about a couple, the most significant being Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, in that discussion of Texas and the growing movement of abolition. So this is what they were trying to do, control the institution of slavery and also to defend it. I think that would be another element of what slave owners were doing and the South was doing. So it moves slavery more to the South. It expands into the Black Belt, we call that because of the soil in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and moved into Texas, and the numbers expanded greatly as well. So those are a couple of the trends of antebellum slavery. Antebellum slavery is not a one-size-fits-all type of institution. Slaves faced a wide variety of conditions because some lived on plantations, others lived on small farms. There were slaves who lived in cities. That was another element of the new scholarship, people writing about the institution of slavery in the 60s and 70s. Urban slaves. Well, there aren't a lot of cities in the South. You can count them really on one hand. New Orleans, Charleston, Richmond. That's really all of them before, that equivalent of cities in the North. And so they would have lived a dramatically different life, a slave on a farm or plantation, than the one that lived in a city. More than likely, you would see slaves working beside their owners. And contact with the master depended on what size of holdings a slave actually was forced to work on. So we'll deal with the intricacies and the reality of slavery, how it would have looked if you traveled to the South. A few slaves in South Carolina and Louisiana owned other slaves. This did happen. Very rare, but it did happen. We also know the Native Americans owned slaves, African slaves, because the Cherokee owned slaves in Georgia, as they were told, if you want to live amongst the whites, live like the whites, and many of them farmed. They were slave owners, to the tune of probably about a third of the Cherokees in Georgia were actually slave owners themselves. Slaves served as a number of roles on farms and plantations around the South. They were preachers, they were carpenters, blacksmiths, they were house servants, they were drivers, those that would drive field hands to work. They were laborers, of course, working the cash crops, growing everything from cotton, sugar, rice, tobacco, wheat, depending on where you were in the American South. As I mentioned, they also lived in American cities. So there is no one slavery, a typical slave in the South. You can't say that because it doesn't exist. It all depends on what state, what crop, what conditions, whether you lived among 100 slaves or you lived among 2 others. Your owner was a large slave owner or a smaller slave owner. So in other words, location did matter. If you are a slave on a large cotton plantation in Mississippi, you have a very, very different experience from a slave in Kentucky growing hemp. The cycle of when you worked, how much you worked, harvesting, and everything was very different. And the slave who worked in Mississippi at a cotton plantation or hemp in Kentucky had a different experience than those African Americans in New Orleans or in Baltimore. But it is not an invisible institution, slavery. Let me again pull up the PowerPoint here. We'll show you where slavery moves. Okay, concentrations of slavery in the southern states, not always easy to see here. There you have it. You can see the concentrations in coastal South Carolina and Georgia. You can see in central western Alabama. Look on the Mississippi River there. Mississippi all the way down to New Orleans, East Texas. Okay, so let's go by the numbers a little bit. Slaves account for 1/3 of the population in the South in the antebellum period. 1 out of 3 people is enslaved. But depending on where we're talking about in the United States, the percentage of slaves in a given state is very, very different. 1.6, less than 2% of the population in Delaware is enslaved. Delaware with slaves, you're thinking? Yes, it's considered a southern slave state, as is Maryland. 1.6% in Delaware. Compare that to 57% in South Carolina. 60% of the population enslaved. Another misconception is how many slaves and large slave owners actually existed. So we have an image of slavery. The movies and Gone with the Wind and other horrible portrayals of the South, of course, give us an impression of the big house, the plantation. That was the typical way that we actually would witness slavery in the American South, and that simply wasn't the case. So there's misconceptions about how many large slave owners actually existed or how many Southerners owned slaves. Again, these are numbers to tell a story. These are not the things you have to have committed to memory. I just want to give you some of the, again, perceptions and realities of the institution of slavery. 3% of Southern slave holders, that statistic is in the notes. 3% of Southern slave holders owned more than 50 slaves. 3%. So the oak alley of trees that goes to the big house, you'd see them, yes, but that would not be typical. That would be completely atypical of what you would see in the South. Large plantations, in other words, were rare. Where you did see them, there could be high concentrations. We saw the map. Coastal South Carolina, areas of Georgia, lower parts of Louisiana. Remember from that map I showed you, the Mississippi on both sides of it. They used to call that from Natchez, Mississippi to New Orleans, Millionaire's Row. And that was in 1840 or 50 money, millionaires. What it would convert to now, probably tens of millions easily. One example is Ascension Parish, Louisiana. It's one of the highest concentrations of slaves in the United States. In Ascension Parish, half of the slaves lived on plantations containing 175 slaves or more. Rare, but concentrated in that area. So that was the exception to the rule. It's highly, highly atypical. Half of Southern slaves lived in holdings of 10 to 49. Let's go back to the actual, let's go back to the PowerPoint here for a second. You see the reality of this and how it played out, okay? This represents slave ownership in the South prior to the American Civil War. 25% of Southern families owned slaves. And you're thinking, no, with all the numbers you just gave me, that's impossible to compute, but it's true. Slave holding was a minority in the South. 25% of Southern families owned slaves. That means 75% did not. Would this group like to get in this group? Hell yes. It's the way to get to wealth, land and slaves, cash crops, export. Were those in the non-slave holding class part of the slave holding class at some point in their life? Yes. And they may have had to sell slaves. The Panic of 1837, which we just talked about. So 25%. So how do you, again, control and make the policies of the nation with a slave-holding minority? A lot of people in the North were beginning to wonder that same thing. We're going to use a term in the remaining lectures that we have in this class. One of them is the slave power. Obviously, it doesn't refer to the power of slaves. Legally, they are essentially powerless. What it does refer to is the idea that this slave-holding minority in the South, and the South is a region, how in the world are they getting to set the national policies? The power of pro-slavery politics to affect the national dialogue and decisions that are made. Will this territory be open for slavery? Will it be banned? Will there be a stronger law that everyone, North and South, has to return and aid in the return of escaped slaves? These are the kind of questions that are being asked. This is the idea of the slave power. Okay, so when we're talking about the 25% that own slaves, in that group, only 1/2 of 1%, 0.6%, own 50 or more slaves. The typical slave-holding group in the South would own, 5% would own 1, about 8% would own 2 to 4. So you're talking here, this group, 6, 8, and 5, would be the most prevalent appearance of slave ownership in the South. And you probably see slave owners and slaves working side by side. So it blows up the idea, the traditional appearance that we have and mindset that we have of slavery, the grand plantations. Yes, they did exist, and when there were these extremes of wealth, they were in the form of land. Sugar plantations, we've seen them if you ever traveled south down towards New Orleans. Think about the cotton that would be in Alabama and Mississippi. Going back to, obviously, the rice plantations and the tobacco plantations that go back to the 1600s. Most slaves were, in the American South, field hands. And they were usually divided into 2 types of work groups. It was known as the gang and the task system. This is an example of the gang system, usually depended on concentrated labor on one particular crop. Sugarcane here, cotton here. All hands on deck, time to harvest the sugarcane before the frost came, and that would kill the sugar and the quality of the sugar juice would be abysmal. Or, of course, picking cotton and then taking it to the gin, or it could be processed even faster. On other smaller holdings, you might see more often the task system. A slave would be given multiple jobs during the day. Cut wood, clear a field, get water, repair a roof, the task system. Now, that probably was more the case if you are a slave owner who owned a smaller number of slaves. You couldn't say, look, I own 50, 30 are going to pick cotton and the rest are going to do other things around the plantation. You didn't have that same luxury. Slaves on large plantations worked in gangs, and they were usually headed by a slave driver who would be chosen by the owner. Now, in this artist's rendering, it shows that the driver could be white or black. In many cases, there were overseers who, when the plantation owner was absentee, wasn't around, maybe they had a rice plantation outside Charleston and they also had a home in the city, they would turn over the duties to an overseer who could be white or black. But the day-to-day operations about making sure slaves were productive went to the driver. And so there were strength, intelligence, and loyalty that goes in the selection of the slave driver and the overseer as well. We have accounts of slave owners saying, well, I can't get a reliable overseer because they don't meet my standards. And you can obviously change, and in many of the cases in the larger holdings and plantations, you saw overseers' houses, a dedicated dwelling there near the slave cabins, which I'll show you some pictures of as we go along. The strongest men who were slaves obviously were the plow hands. Others who were younger or less fit, women, would do other jobs on the plantation as well. You could also have those dedicated to weeding, clearing yards. That was sometimes given to those slaves who were sick or older or who were pregnant. The idea here is to be self-sufficient, to make it and grow it on the property. Otherwise, you have to go and buy it. And so you would often train slaves at different tasks who would be specialists in that area. If you look at life on a large plantation, at sunup, drivers would send gangs into the fields to do work. That's how everything started. The plantation would usually have some kind of bell, and that would be the beginning of the work day, work all day, usually 6 days a week. That depended on the slave owner. Simply say that this was the work regimen of an American slave before the Civil War was inaccurate. It depended on who was the owner and what part of the American South that you were talking about. And a lot of it had to do with if you were part of the gang system or the task system. So when you went to the field as a field hand, Solomon Northup, the man who wrote 12 Years a Slave, a book that became a very good movie about slavery. I would not turn to Hollywood for history. For the most part, it's awful. Every once in a while, they do some good things. And this dramatization of Solomon Northup, who was a free man, he was a musician in New York, kidnapped, drugged and kidnapped, and brought south through Washington, D.C. and New Orleans, and worked on a plantation not far from here, in the Alexandria, Louisiana area. Solomon Northup described what would happen working in the field. Quote, during all these hoeings, the overseer or driver follows the slaves on horseback with a whip. The fastest hoer takes the lead row. He is usually about a rod in advance of his companions. If one of them passes him, he is whipped. If one falls behind or is a moment idle, he is whipped, unquote. That's Northrop's account of working in a gang system on a cotton plantation. Small children were put to work as well. Again, complete and total use of all of the labor. Slaves were owned. They owned the children of the slaves as well. So it encouraged slave owners to have slave families. Again, you own the children unless you decided to free them. Slaves got married, but there is no state in the South that recognizes slave marriage as legal. So there were marriages, but they weren't official according to the law. Slave owners said, look, if these two have a union and children, I own the children. That's good for me. That's good for business. So complete and total employment. Small children will be put to work as water carriers or doing light tasks. They often played with white children in southern farms and plantations. Frederick Douglass, who writes another very famous slave narrative. He was a slave in Maryland until he escaped and made his way to freedom in the North. Frederick Douglass talks about not realizing that he was a slave until late in his childhood. He did the things that the white kids did too, until he was probably shuttled off old enough and strong enough to work at a task or in a field. Slaves who were too old or feeble for field work would take care of small children or work in stables. And that's what slave owners often prided themselves in. They said, even compared to the work system that is in the North, the wage system in the North, we have full employment. Again, to be self-sufficient on a farm or plantation, to make it, create it, grow it. Otherwise, you have to buy it, and that costs money. Slaves in the task system were encouraged to finish early. Get your list of chores or work done early, and then you could maybe spend the rest of the day on your own, depending on your owner. There was no rule that said if you completed these things and did 12 hours of work, you get to go fish if you're a slave, or tend to the garden plot that you might have behind a slave cabin, or spend time visiting family members. Sometimes the tasks could be an all-day affair. Sometimes they were simply things like repairing fences. And those that were in the larger plantations had the ability to say, you are the blacksmith on the farm, you are the cook. Cooking was a job that was actually a position of trust and a highly respected one, and it also was dangerous. We know that behind childbirth, for white and blacks, fire because of cooking. That's why if you ever see these surviving plantation homes, the kitchen is always separate. The house catches on fire, it all goes. If the kitchen's inside the house, usually it would be separate. What makes slavery unique, and what makes it unique during the antebellum period, is that slaves are both subjects and objects. The problem of slavery. One historian talked about what he called the problem of slavery. And what he meant by that, when he based his whole career on talking about the problem of slavery, it was the notion that by law, slave owners and the Southern governments tried to define slaves as property. That's what they were. They were property. But at the same time, you had to acknowledge that slaves were human and could make their own choices. They were not simply objects, they were subjects, and you tried to control them, but you had to take into account that they had kids and they would try to rebel or escape for a long time or lead a rebellion. So in the period of the antebellum period, 1820 to 1860, we see more and more slave owners define their relationship with their slaves, the people they owned, as paternalistic. It wasn't bad. It was painless slavery. And they especially began to compare slavery to the system of how people worked in the North. Because you have to understand that in the South, they're facing more criticism from the North and from other parts of the world and from people within the South. Remember, 3/4 of people in the South don't own slaves. We're going to talk about, when we get into the development of the West, the idea that the West should be open for free people. This idea of free labor. They didn't mean that you shouldn't pay people who work for you. They meant that free people should pay free people wages. And when slavery moves into a territory like Kansas or Nebraska, two territories we're going to talk about in the future, if slave owners and slaves move in, people who want to pay people wages can't move in, because slavery is unfair. It's unfair to the slave, it's unfair to the slave owner, and it's unfair to people who want to pay people wages. If slavery moves into a territory, free labor can't. Now, it allows people in the North to say, I don't give a whit about your average slave in South Carolina or Louisiana, but I do care about the idea of fairness, economic fairness. And we should keep slaves, and we should keep free black people out of the territories. The free labor wasn't just a high-minded economic idea. There was out and out racism built in there as well. But getting back to the comparisons, slave owners felt on the defensive. Around the time of the American Revolution, they would say things like, slavery is a necessary evil. Our parents and grandparents brought it here. We don't know how to end it. If we were to eliminate it from the economy of the South, it would crash. And in many cases, they were right. South Carolina and Deep South, that would absolutely be the case. Delaware, with 1.6% of the population enslaved, maybe not so much. So necessary evil. Then, after the Missouri Compromise, something changes. We begin to see slave owners refer to it as a positive good. Slavery is good for the slave owner, for the slave. They begin to make biblical arguments about how slavery had always existed. They begin to make arguments about the inferiority of people of the African race. Scientific mumbo jumbo. It essentially says, no, their brains can never develop like whites. If they were free, there would be a race war. And they would immediately try to kill all the white folks. They brought about dangers of miscegenation, mixed race children. This is the fear that kept the system in place, where 25% own slaves and 75% don't. That's going to be an important argument, because you're going to need people who don't own slaves to what? Put on a gray uniform and go fight in a Civil War regiment in 1860 when the South secedes. So what did folks in the South say? Okay, fine. You in the North, you holier-than-thou Northerners, you Yankees think you can criticize our system, but what do you have? You have people over there that you pay an hourly wage for 12 to, there's no laws on free labor, how long they could work. Oh, the 8-hour day. Nope, it was 12 or 16 hours. Recent immigrants coming in that you would treat as, and they use this term, wage slaves. But we in the South have cradle-to-grave care over our people. They meant their slaves, which they said was a favorable comparison to what was happening in the North, the wage slavery argument versus the idea of benign Southern slavery. This is a sampling of what was discussed in the country during the period from 1820 to 1860. Masters see slaves as not just laborers, but their people. They're inferior members of their extended household, who they expect work and obedience. But we have a responsibility as a slave owner to provide guidance and protection. Now, it's hard to get in the minds of the slave owners. A lot has been written about slave owners, and thankfully more has been written about the slavery from the slaves' point of view. But they consider at all times profit and income as a motive force for how you treat slaves. Of course, you have to bring profit, returns on your investment, and balance that with what? Control. Control that you have to exert, personal power. So we have references in diaries from Southerners of whites showing affection for slaves, for genuine caring for them, except for the part where they own other people, of course. That's the major irony of all that situation. In economic terms, owners want to maximize profits and protect the value of their investment. So it makes sense to provide some kind of basic standard of living to promote health and fertility. In 1808, the United States shut off our connection to the international slave trade. And people in the South panicked. Where are we going to get slaves from now on? Not realizing, of course, that every 25 years, almost at the same rapid rate as whites, African Americans were doubling their population. We call it natural increase. No matter what your race is, that is a statistic. That means it's going to benefit the country as a whole. The population was doubling 25 years. So Southerners said, oh my gosh, we will not be able to purchase slaves from West Africa and the Caribbean anymore. What will happen? Well, they didn't have to worry, because slavery, we know, moved from the old colonial South to the Deep South after the War of 1812. And owners, with that in mind, said, we have to keep slave morale as high as possible, encourage them to do their work, and promote fertility and health. Make sure that this is a sustainable population that we can keep. It benefits us that the slaves that we own have an unofficial marriage, or two people have kids, because we own the kids and their children's children. And we keep this going throughout the generations. But kindness and humanity towards slaves was not an indication that slaves would stay on farms. Why? I don't know, because maybe owning another person is appreciated by the person that you owned. Look at ads from Runaways, and here's one right here. You see examples of things like, Cuffy was friendly and wanted to please. It's like the owners are saying in these ads, I have no idea why the guy or girl would want to run away. I mean, other than the fact that they were enslaved, but that part isn't usually stated in the newspaper advertisement. And that's what this is right here. My Negro boy named Fagans, who was heavily built, about 5 feet 8 or 10 inches high, nearly 35 years old, has a heavy black beard, large and long forehead. When you see a slave advertisement, the description would be as much detail as was possible. Now, I've studied these looking at John Sibley, from Sibley Lake here in town and all that, the Indian agent. He ran a newspaper in North Carolina before he came to Louisiana. One of the things that were in his newspaper were advertisements for runaway slaves. And so the slave owner would put, ran away. This one starts like this one I'm showing you now. Ran away from subscriber, and you see it here, meaning I subscribe to the newspaper. I'm also going to put an ad saying someone I own, a guy or girl, ran away. And so you usually provide as much information as possible. Lost one of his front teeth. He has a markable, long, sharp nose. That means people are going to look for the escaped slave or fugitive slave. There'd be a reward. Also, any information that the owner had. I think he or she is going here. She has family in the county one over. And that's why I think he or she may have run away. So you provide as much information as possible in these ads. But it always baffles and stuns us that slave owners would write things like that. I don't know why they would actually go and run away. Sometimes slave owners would write in the advertisements, he or she will not face harsh punishment upon their return. You have to understand that in the system of slavery, some slave owners knew that the people that they owned were going to run away temporarily and come back. Look, I as a slave owner, someone might think, sold the person who they considered to be their wife. There was no law that says you can't break up families. You have 4 kids? Great, 2 are coming with my nephew in another state, but I own you. And the law supported that. It was against the law to outright murder a slave or to meet punishment that was going to result in some kind of deformity. But again, was that prosecuted? That depends on the state. And so whether or not you could split up families, that was done. So the owners would say, I'm pretty sure that they were leaving and they were maybe going to come back because they were seeing family members at a distant farm or plantation. So owners expect gratitude and act for their leniency. If there is an act of kindness by the owner, they were expecting slaves to be, of course, obedient, which again brings up one of many of the ironies about the system of slavery, because at the end of the day, you owned these individuals. So with this paternalistic idea, you also get an impression, and this is a difficult statement to try to kind of look at and evaluate objectively, but the care of slaves got better in the period before the Civil War. It's like saying, oh, he was a kindly slave owner. Well, yeah, but in the end, they were still a slave owner. In advance, we know from the colonies, the treatment of slaves. There was an abundant supply of food for white and black in the United States. We were past the frontier colonial days. We know that there was some statements we can make about the basics of life provided to slaves. Probably about 8 quarts of cornmeal and 2.5 to 4 pounds of pork or bacon or another meat per week. Doesn't sound like a lot because it wasn't. It would be supplemented by numerous items according to where the slave lived, or the season, or what slaves could find, or hunt, or catch. They're allowed to fish. Many slave owners allowed their slaves to have a garden plot where they could have animals of their own. Fruit, sugar, coffee was sometimes given along with whiskey. This all depended on the owner, if he or she decided to give out those items. Slaves' housing and clothing were generally crude but functional. Slave owners in colonial times, well, they basically found shelter in barns and lofts and outbuildings. Later on, it changed. It changed because those who were on larger farms and holdings actually began to build slave cabins. The surviving ones we can see in one instance. 16 by 18 cabin. Owners and overseers would regularly visit slave quarters, as they were called. This would be the quarters, meaning the slave quarters or the slave row of cabins. This is not far from us. This is at the Magnolia Plantation, surviving slave cabins. Each cabin, of course, had to be kept clean, and overseers and drivers would visit these dwellings of slaves to make sure that was the case. Field hands received 4 suits of clothing per year. Pants and shirts for men, dresses for women. They were often made of rough cotton, brown cotton that wasn't used, suitable for manufacture, to be sold to the larger public, but what they called and nicknamed Negro cloth, because it was dedicated to slaves, would be manufactured in the North and sold in the South, reminding us always, of course, that this is a national institution, that of slavery. And slaves were not robots. They adopted their own faith, kind of a combination of traditions from Africa and the Caribbean, combining it with Christianity, stressing the part of liberation and not maybe so much about the area of obedience, so blind obedience to their slave owners. That gives us a little insight about the life of slaves. What about slavery, the institution itself? This is one argument that historians have loved to have over the last several years. Would it have lasted? Was it economically viable? The answer to that question is overwhelmingly yes. How many people can actually run a business that loses money and still continue to lose that business and operate it? You can't. Slavery was viable. The South had certain advantages that kept the institution alive. First of all, there was always a demand for the cash crops that slaves were instrumental in growing. Cotton, hemp, sugarcane. The government created, again, a great climate to make sure that those exports raised by slaves in the South went out to other countries around the world. There was a demand for it. The Industrial Revolution in England helped fuel the development of the Cotton Kingdom in the Deep South. A black man brings from Haiti after the Revolution on Saint-Domingue a technology by which they plant sugar cane along the southern areas of the Mississippi River. Would it have lasted beyond 1865 when we have emancipation and the end of slavery? Yes, the answer is. It could have lasted, some people think, till 1900. Why? Because there was a profit attached with slavery. We often say, well, it's backward. If it is, why did the whole Southern economy crash after emancipation? Why? Because slaves were taken out of it. 4 million were freed. The road to wealth was through slavery. Those who were not slave owners wanted to be slave owners. So again, it would have probably continued if it were not for emancipation. By 1840, just to give you a statistic to illustrate how important the southern crops are to the nation, the South, the southern United States in 1840, the South alone grows 60% of the world's cotton. 60% of the world's cotton. And that 60% of cotton and the exports of cotton are half of all American exports in one crop, cotton from the South, grown by slaves. Louisiana sugar plantations are always looking for ways to innovate and technologically advance, to use steam power to turn the juice from the plant into sugar cane. So they were going to invest in that. In 1850, someone says, and this is one of the most famous quotes about the South and slavery and the Cotton Kingdom. Cotton is king. You dare not make war on cotton. Cotton is king. That's absolutely true. In 1860, the year before the Civil War starts, the South has their best, most productive Southern export crop ever. So to say, well, without the war, it would have just died a natural death. I don't think so. If it did, it would have taken a long time. The South has a crop that allows it to keep alive. They have new land. They have a crop that foreign markets want. Slaves are increasing naturally in their population, so they have a labor force. And the North supports it. Northern ships, insurance companies, and banks all invest in slavery as an institution, and that allows it to keep it going. Okay. So again, kind of a bump out lecture on a topic that we're not following kind of a chronological path about, but now that we're getting into the time of manifest destiny and American expansion across the continent possibly, and an impending war with the nation of Mexico that at the time controlled California, the American Southwest, and other claims of North America, you can see why this is pretty timely to introduce this topic and give you some background about it. Okay, assignment for Friday will be the exam. No lecture over the Friday to Monday period. This lecture, this material, is the last bit that is potentially up there for the exam. Make sure you review everything. By tomorrow, there will be a review guide for the terms you should be familiar with, and the format of the exam will follow what you know and already have seen in the other exams. So before you leave, please also sign the roll for me. And we'll see everybody here or in Teams Monday of next week.